All right, I think I'm good to go. This is Random Thoughts from County Antrim on this, the 28th day of November 2020, the last podcast of the month of November. And these are my random thoughts. I have, today I want to tell you a story which I think may be a true story. But first I just want to remind you of it all that it's just been a very, very busy week in the news. And I have a good friend who's kind of going through withdrawal symptoms right now. He's a political junkie, and he's at a loss of what to do now that the election is over. Personally, I don't think the election is over. I don't think it'll be over until we see two men and a truck parked in front of the White House, which will probably be the morning of January 20th in 2021. That's just my guess. But my friend, I've known him for a long, long time. In fact, we were roommates for a couple of semesters in college. He's a fascinating guy in many respects. He's quite ordinary in many others, but he does have one peculiar characteristic, and that is that he has webbed feet. And he's very, very self-conscious about this. He doesn't like people to know that he has webbed feet. You'll never see him in bare feet. You'll never see him wearing sandals or anything else that would show his feet. I've known him for years, and I've never seen him wear flip-flops, which he probably could not wear even if he wanted to, because I don't think he could wrap his toes around that little piece that connects the sole of the flip-flop with the top. There's probably a name for that little piece. I don't even know what it is, but whatever it is, it's a place where most of us wrap our big toe on one side and our second toe on the other, and that's how we hold the flip-flop on our feet. But my friend could never do that. I think I first noticed there was something peculiar about him when we lived in the dormitory in college. It was an old dormitory built in the 1920s, and there was a communal shower down the hall, one of those large communal areas, communal showers. And whenever he took a shower, he came back into our room with wet socks, because evidently he took a shower with his socks on. He didn't want anybody to see his webbed feet. And our dorm had an old radiator. That was our heat source. And what he did is when he got back in the room, he took off his wet socks, put them on the radiator to dry, and quickly put on dry socks. And I did notice one day, quite accidentally, when he was changing his clothes, that he had webbed feet. And I was curious as to why his feet were webbed, but I just was too polite to ask. Now, I'd met his father. His father was named Seamus, and I met his father many, many, many times, both in college and for many years after. Wonderful guy. But I never met my friend's mother. And I assumed that he had one. I mean, biologically speaking, I would assume that there was a mother involved in there somehow. But again, he never talked about her, and as a result, I never asked about her. And so I never did learn anything about his webbed feet or his mother, even though I've known this friend for decades. And that is until quite recently. Recently, Seamus died, my friend's father. And I went to his wake. His wake was in County Antrim, not far from where I live right now, where I'm broadcasting this podcast. And as you might expect of a wake, there was a fair amount of alcohol involved. Most of the people, though, were quite tight-lipped. No one, people told some stories about Seamus, but no one mentioned anything about my friend's mother, or no one mentioned anything about webbed feet. But Seamus' sister was there, and she had a bit too much to drink, and her tongue loosened as a result of that. She was, feeling no pain, which I guess is a good way to feel. And at one point, I was standing next to her, and at one point she kind of leaned over to me and asked, "Did you ever hear the story of how your friend came to have webbed feet?" And I confessed that I had not. And with that, she told me the full story. And that is the story I'm going to tell you right now. Now, it seems that Seamus, long before I met him, had a great eye for the women. It was not for nothing that he was looking so fervently. There wouldn't be a dance, a crossroads, or a session at a pub that Seamus wouldn't be there. And he'd be dressed to the fullest, and he wore a tie, one of those real wide ties that could almost serve as a tablecloth. It was so wide. And he had enough oil on his head that it would pollute the entire Atlantic Ocean if he ever went into the ocean. But despite all of his dolling up whenever he went out, he had very, very poor headway with the fairer sex. Someone might dance with him, but that would be the limit. And most women would even say no when he asked to dance. He even took up line dancing so that he could dance next to a woman without even having to ask. I might guess from this, he was not the most handsome man in the world. Someone once said about him, in fact, someone said this at the wake, that the good Lord must have been thinking about something else when he created Seamus, because he did not have much in the way of good looks. And he wasn't very tall either. He often wore padding in the heels of his shoes to just give him a bit of a lift. And that made it very difficult for him to walk gracefully, let alone dance a jig or a reel. But as time wore on, it was still much the same. His chances of getting married were getting slimmer and slimmer. Now, once in the morning, he took. It was in the springtime, as I recall the story, and it was on a Sunday. He took a walk along the shores of Lake Michigan, not far where I'm sitting today. Lake Michigan is just on the other side of this wall of my home in County Antrim. And while he was walking along the shore of the lake, he took a look across the water. And what do you think he saw? There was a large rock which protruded above the lake. And what do you think he saw on that lake? Well, it was a beautiful mermaid. And she was combing her long golden hair with the bones of a Lake Michigan salmon. And she had her back to him at the time. And I bet you didn't know there were mermaids in the Great Lakes, but evidently there are, which certainly was to Seamus's good fortune, as you will soon find out. Now, the sight of this mermaid just took the sight right out of, just sucked the sight right out of Seamus's eyes. And she, again, had her back to him, so didn't even see him. But Seamus just stood there on the ground. You know, he was a man dazzled by what he saw. And after a while, he came to himself, and he noticed that there was, next to her, lying on the rock on which she was perched, right next to her, was an enchanted cap. And Seamus must have known, he probably heard a story from a Shawnee like me years before, that if he captured that cap, the mermaid was powerless to go back into the sea. And Seamus thought a while, and he thought to himself, he said, I just been powerless to find a woman on land. I will try to get a woman on the lake. And with that, Seamus jumped into the water. And the mermaid turned around suddenly to see him. But it was too late, because Seamus reached over and grabbed the enchanted cap. Now, she let out a moan. I mean, the kind of moan that would have let you would have had to have pity on her, because it was such a mournful, loud moan. But Seamus kept on holding the hat because he wanted to see what would turn out from all of this. Now, Seamus noticed that when she was reaching for the cap, because she was trying to get it back, and when she reached for the cap, Seamus noticed she had beautiful hands, beautiful fingers, but there were skin between each of the fingers, much like you would see on a duck or a goose. Seamus tried to make some conversation. He said, "What's your name?" And he got no reply. And he didn't know if this was because she couldn't hear, being a woman of the water, or perhaps simply didn't understand the language. So he reached out. He had the cap on one hand, he reached out with the other, put his hand in hers, and gave it just a gentle squeeze. And that is perhaps the universal language, and everyone understands what that means. And all of a sudden, her moaning and her whining stopped. And Seamus told her that he had a farm and a house on land nearby, and on that he had a donkey and 4 cows and 2 goats and 14 chickens. And he talked about his farm a little more, and the mermaid became just a different girl altogether. She stepped off the rock and stood up straight. She was tall and as graceful as any woman you would ever see on land or in water. And she was taller than Seamus, and Seamus looked up into her eyes and said, "You may be a woman of the water, but I will make you a happy married woman on land if you are willing." And she said to Seamus' surprise, he said, "I am ready and willing." And then she went back, sat on the stone, finished combing her hair, because, I suppose that she guessed that she was going to be among strangers soon, and she had to look the best that she could when that happened. And when she was done, she bent down over the water and whispered just a few inches above the surface of the water. Whispered something. And Seamus could see the ripple of the water from where she was whispering just emanate out from that spot. And he wondered, what is she up to? And she must have suspected that. She must have known he was wondering. And so she turned to him and said, "I'm sending word down to my father in the land under the lake. I'm telling him that I'm in good hands and that I have found a good match." "So tell me," said Seamus, "who is your father?" She says, "Well, I'll have you know, my father is the king of the waves of Lake Michigan." "Glory be," said Seamus. He said, "What a blessed day this is. I will marry a beautiful woman with a king as her father." And Seamus thought a little bit more. He says, "Well, there's your father, a man of money." He says, "Well, money to me, to us, is as plentiful as the leaves falling in the autumn. All I have to do is ask the waves, and the money will come, plentiful." Oh, at that point, Seamus invited the mermaid to come up with him, come to his house. And so the two of them did so. Now, on the way to the house, they walked past a church. And the services had just ended, but the pastor was still there. So Seamus and the mermaid walked into the church and told the old pastor, he says, "We've come to get married." Well, the pastor took one look at the bride-to-be, and he says, "Is your intention to marry a fish?" He says, "My advice to you, Seamus, is to take this lass back to where she came from. Besides, she's a bit too tall for you." Well, Seamus wasn't sure what to do. He said, She is perhaps a bit too tall for me, but, she's not always going to be standing. And he says, I just don't care. I just want to marry her. I know she's a fish, but I think I just want to marry her. Now, the pastor said, I just don't know. I don't know. I never married a man to a fish before. And Seamus said, well, if you marry us, we will make it worth your while. Because you see, I'm now a man of money. So the old pastor thought about it a while. He said, I suppose your case is exceptional. And besides, the church is due another remodel, so perhaps we could use additional more funds. So, with that, and to make a long story short, or maybe it's too late to make a long story short, with that, the pastor married Seamus and the mermaid. And the two of them were not idle, for it wasn't too many years after that the two of them had 4 children, one of which is my good friend. And all 4 children are wonderful people, as normal as any other children in County Antrim, except for one thing. They all have webbed feet. Now, one morning, years later, Seamus left for town. He was going to sell. He had a mission. He was going to sell one of his cows. And no sooner did he leave that his wife began to clean the house. And she did some dusting and some mopping and moving things around all through the house. Excuse me. And then she went up into the loft, which she didn't go into very often. Went into the loft and started cleaning up some things there. And she saw there was a gable, and hanging on the gable was an old fishing net. And she decided to clean around that, so she took the fishing net off the gable. And what do you think she saw behind the fishing net? It was her enchanted cap, hidden away for all these years. And the minute she laid eyes on it, she just felt this powerful longing to go back to the sea. She thought about her father, and she thought about her mother, and she thought about her brothers and sisters and other family members, and how she missed them all. Then she thought about Seamus, and she thought about her children, and began to be torn about what to do now that she knew where her enchanted cap was. But then she decided, after much thinking, she decided and said to herself, I will go back home beneath the lake. And in no time at all, I'll come back to Seamus and the children. So then she went down the loft to the main level. She said goodbye to her children. She told her oldest child to make sure she took care of the younger ones. And she walked from there to the shores of Lake Michigan. And as she got closer and closer, she just felt this emotional tug to go into the water. She then put on her enchanted cap and then slid into the water. Later that day, Seamus came home after selling his cow. And he arrived home. He just felt this sense of bereavement, and he wasn't sure why. And then he saw the absence of his wife, and he asked the children about her. And they told him that she had left earlier in the day, and that she was carrying a cap, and a cap they had never seen before. So Seamus suspected what it was, and he rushed up the loft and moved the fishing net. And he saw the cap was gone. And that's when the terrible truth kind of flashed across his brain. Like a madman, he rushed out of the house, ran to the lake, straight to the rock where he first laid eyes on her. But there was no trace of her at all. And in fact, sadly, there was no trace of her ever again. But the mermaid, Seamus's wife, never did forget Seamus or their children. Every Sunday morning, right at dawn, there was always seaweed perched on top of that rock. And underneath the seaweed was a gold piece. And that gold piece, Sunday after Sunday, left Seamus and the children in comfort for the rest of their days. And the man who collected that gold piece every Sunday morning was the man whose wake I was attending that day. The father of my good friend. And that's my story for you. It explains why my friend, my former college roommate, has webbed feet. And if there is a lie in that story, it wasn't me who put it there. I'm only telling you what I heard at Seamus's wake. Now that's the story. It's my take, actually, of a story that I recently heard from Bat Burns. I've made a significant amount of changes to the story, enough that I can kind of call it my own, but it's not. It's a story by Bat Burns. Now, Bat is a brilliant storyteller. He lives in the village of Sneem in County Kerry in Ireland. And I had the pleasure of meeting him there when I was a teller at the Sneem Storytelling Festival. It was a wonderful festival. It was at a village. I mean, the village had one hotel, and they had a large dining room. And the headliners told their stories Friday evening and Saturday evening in this large dining area. The rest of the festival was held at, actually there was a small room at the hotel, but mainly it was the festival was held at the village pubs. And Sneem, although a small village, had 3 pubs. And basically the tellers would go from pub to pub. We'd go to one at 3 in the afternoon, and then we'd all walk across the street and go to another pub at 6 in the evening, and then walk across to another pub at 9 in the evening, telling stories at each of the pubs. And that was the festival. It was a brilliant format. I'm sure there were people at any one or more of these pubs wondering, what the heck is going on? I came here for a pint, and these people barge in and start telling stories. But that was the storytelling festival in Sneem, and our host was Bat Burns. Now, there were signs. I mean, you shouldn't have been surprised the storytellers were going to barge into the pub. There were signs and posters all over the place about the festival. And the signs were kind of unique. There were like 4 headliners. Bat Burns, one of the other headliners was Claire Moore Murphy, who was, again, another brilliant storyteller. There were 2 others, and between you and me, the others weren't all that good, but there was 4 headliners. And then they had a 5th row. And the 5th row, after the 4 headliners, it says, Tellers from Abroad. And that was me. I was one of the tellers from abroad. There was 4 of us, actually. There was another American, a Canadian, and an Australian. But that's where I met Bat Burns, and that's where I met became to admire his storytelling skills, and I later heard the story that he told, which I just retold to you. Now I should add, I just received the latest edition of National Geographic. I don't know if you can see it here, or see the title. It's called Saving the Great Lakes. That's the December edition of National Geographic. And I've only taken a glance at the magazine thus far, and I'm going to read it cover to cover because I love the Great Lakes, number 1. But number 2, I want to see if there's any mention about the Great Lakes mermaids. There should be if there's not. All right, before I close, I want to tell you about my experience thus far with my website. And I'm not positive about this, but I think that whenever you change the host of a website or the platform for the site or whatever, people come out of the woodwork. Because I've been getting the strangest emails over the past 2 or 3 weeks than I've got in a long, long time. One of them was a guy who threatened me with a lawsuit for using his copyrighted images. And I know this is BS because the images in my site are all mine. Often, many of them are photographs taken by my wife. And those that aren't are those that I got permission to use or verified that it was in the public domain. I'm very, very scrupulous about this. I don't want to use other people's work without giving them attribution and without getting their permission. But this email claimed that I stole images, and it provided a long link. It was the link was this long, where he could prove his claim and see all the images that I had stolen. Well, I didn't open the link. There are just two reasons. One is I was confident images were mine, but there were so many typographical errors in his email that I assumed that either he was from Nigeria, or perhaps he was one of Donald Trump's lawyers. So I was reasonably certain that if I opened up this link, it would lead me down some sort of internet disaster. I also received an email from a guy who said, now that I have a website, all I had to do was let him know what I wanted for content, and he would write it for me. And since I'm a writer, I ignored that email as well. And I also received a whole series of emails from different senders, but every sender was an unknown gibberish kind of name. Let me read you the name of one of these senders of email, and I can't pronounce it, but it's spelled VECGXGBOZSU. Now, I've received many others with the same kind of gibberish as identifying the sender. So obviously I did not respond because I just don't want anybody to figure out, or to be able to, from that, figure out who I am to screw up my computer. And I've never received these before. So I presume that because I have the new website. So anyway, nevertheless, please take a look at my website. It's clandonald.net. If you're mind to, send me an email. My email is clandonald@gmail.com. I promise you I will open it and read it, unless your name is VECGXGBOZSU. Then I might ignore it. Take a look at my books, Clandonald, Storied History of Ireland, Buy the Horse a Guinness. Take a look at anything else that's on my email and or on my Facebook site. But that's enough for now. So, as always, please be safe, be careful, be smart, and do the right thing. So that's all for now. Goodbye.